Jacob Walker's hands gripped the steering wheel of his worn sedan as the evening sun painted Highway 64 in shades of gold and amber. The 17-year-old had worked countless hours at part-time jobs to afford this car, and despite its age, it represented freedom and independence. The radio played softly as he drove home, anticipating dinner with his mother, who always worried when he stayed out late. The peaceful drive shattered when red and blue lights erupted in his rear-view mirror. Jacob's heart sank as he checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. Confusion clouded his mind as he signaled and pulled onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch of rocks under his tires echoing his growing anxiety. Following his mother's careful instructions that had been drilled into him since childhood, Jacob turned off the engine and placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel. His pulse hammered against his chest as he watched a tall officer with mirrored sunglasses approach his window, while his partner remained by the patrol car with a rigid, watchful stance. The first officer's tap on the glass was sharp and authoritative. When Jacob rolled down his window, keeping his movement slow and deliberate, the officer's voice cut through the evening air like ice. License and registration. There was no politeness, no explanation for the stop. Jacob reached carefully for his glove compartment, announcing his actions. "It's in here, officer." He handed over the documents with a tentative smile, hoping to ease attention. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer studied Jacob's license with suspicious intensity before fixing him with a cold stare. "You own this car?" The question carried an undertone of disbelief that Jacob recognized all too well. "Yes, sir," Jacob replied, maintaining his respectful tone despite the officer's obvious skepticism. A twisted smirk played across the officer's lips as he handed the license to his partner. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" "I'm driving home," Jacob answered truthfully. "Just passing through." The officer's expression hardened with doubt. He motioned toward Jacob with an imperious gesture. "Step out of the car." Jacob's blood ran cold. "Why do I need to step out?" he asked cautiously, knowing his rights but fearing the consequences of asserting them. "Step out of the car," the officer repeated, his voice carrying a threatening edge that brooked no argument. Against every instinct screaming danger, Jacob complied. The moment his feet touched the gravel, the second officer moved closer, his predatory gaze scanning Jacob from head to toe, lingering on his clothes, his shoes, and the car he'd been driving. "This is a pretty expensive car," the second officer observed with obvious suspicion. "What do you do for a living?" "I'm a student," Jacob answered firmly, though his voice betrayed his growing fear. Both officers exchanged a look that Jacob had seen before, that mixture of disbelief and condescension that said they thought he was lying. The first officer let out a short, derisive laugh. "A student driving something like this?" Jacob clenched his jaw but held his tongue. He had heard this tone countless times, had seen the stories play out on the news. No matter what he said, they wouldn't believe him. The truth didn't matter when prejudice had already made their decision. "Do you have any weapons in the car?" the first officer demanded, already moving toward the driver's side. "Drugs? Alcohol?" "No," Jacob replied quickly, but the officer was already opening his car door without permission. "Hey!" Jacob protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't do that." The officer ignored him completely, rummaging through Jacob's belongings with callous disregard. He pulled out Jacob's backpack and unzipped it, spilling its innocent contents, textbooks, notebooks, pens, across the passenger seat like evidence of some imagined crime. The second officer stepped menacingly closer to Jacob, his hand hovering near his holster in a gesture that made Jacob's pulse spike with terror. "Son, you need to calm down." "I'm calm," Jacob said, though his voice trembled with barely contained fear. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready for flight, but he knew running would only make things worse. He reached slowly for his phone in his pocket. "I'm calling my mother." "Don't move," the first officer barked, slamming the car door shut with explosive force. Jacob froze, his hand halfway to his pocket, the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on him like a physical force. "I'm calling my mother," he repeated, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I know my rights." The taller officer's smirk widened into something cruel and mocking. "Oh, you know your rights, do you?" His tone dripped with sarcasm and barely concealed contempt. Before Jacob could respond, the second officer grabbed his arm roughly and spun him around. Hands behind your back. Why? Jacob's voice cracked with disbelief and growing panic. I haven't done anything. But they weren't listening anymore. The cold metal handcuff bit into Jacob's wrist as they clicked shut, the sound echoing across the empty highway like a death knell. The officers pushed him down onto the gravel with unnecessary force, pressing his face into the dirt and stones. As Jacob lay there, tasting dust and feeling the sharp bite of rocks against his cheek, he wondered how a simple drive home had become this nightmare. The handcuffs cut into his wrists, and his breathing became shallow and ragged as fear coursed through his veins. Then, through the haze of humiliation and terror, he heard it, the distant rumble of approaching engines, growing steadily louder. The sound of multiple engines approaching cut through the evening air like thunder. Jacob, still pressed face down against the gravel with handcuffs biting into his wrists, felt his heart hammering as the rumbling grew louder. The two officers must have heard it too, because their aggressive postures suddenly shifted to something resembling uncertainty. 3 sleek black SUVs appeared on the horizon, their tinted windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. They moved with military precision, slowing as they approached the scene. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the vehicles pulled over to the shoulder, their imposing presence immediately changing the entire atmosphere of the encounter. The officers stiffened visibly, exchanging nervous glances. Their earlier confidence evaporated like morning mist as the doors of the SUVs opened in perfect synchronization. Men in dark suits emerged, their movements coordinated and professional, their eyes scanning the area with practiced vigilance. These weren't ordinary civilians. Jacob's pulse quickened as he watched from his prone position. The security detail moved with a kind of precision that spoke of serious training and high-level protection work. Their A-pieces and professional bearing made it clear that someone very important was about to step out of that lead vehicle. The taller officer, Grant, was the first to attempt regaining control of the situation. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice lacking its previous authority. "Sir, this is a routine traffic stop. We have it under control." But his words fell flat in the charged atmosphere. The security team continued their assessment, creating a protective perimeter around the vehicles. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then the door of the lead SUV opened, and Donald Trump stepped out. The former president emerged with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention wherever he went. His sleeves were rolled up slightly, giving him a more approachable appearance, but there was nothing casual about his presence. His eyes immediately locked onto the scene before him, Jacob lying helplessly on the ground, the two officers standing over him like predators over prey. Trump's expression hardened as he took in every detail. The sight of a 17-year-old boy handcuffed and pressed into the dirt while 2 grown officers loomed over him clearly struck a nerve. His jaw tightened, and his eyes flashed with something that made even the seasoned officers take an involuntary step backward. Officer Grant attempted to salvage the situation, his voice wavering slightly. "Mr. President, sir, we were just conducting a routine traffic stop. The suspect was acting suspiciously, and we had reason to believe." "Stop." Trump's voice cut through Grant's explanation like a blade through silk. The single word carried such authority that both officers immediately fell silent. "Stop talking right now." Trump continued his approach, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel with each deliberate step. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the scene. His security detail maintained their positions, alert but allowing their principal to handle the situation. "Are you telling me," Trump said, his voice deceptively calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel, "that you pulled this young man over because he's driving a car you think he shouldn't be driving?" The officers remained silent, their earlier bravado completely shattered. The weight of Trump's presence and the implications of their actions were beginning to sink in. They had been caught in the act by one of the most recognizable figures in America, and there would be no spinning this encounter. Trump's gaze shifted to Jacob, and his expression softened noticeably. He approached the teenager with careful steps, his voice taking on a gentler tone. "Are you all right, son?" Jacob, still lying on the gravel with his cheek pressed against the cold ground, managed a weak nod. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Yes, sir." The contrast between Trump's concern for Jacob and his obvious anger toward the officers was stark and unmistakable. He studied the scene for a moment longer, his experienced eye taking in every detail. The scattered contents of Jacob's backpack, the unnecessary handcuffs, the boy's position on the ground. "What's your name?" Trump asked gently, crouching down to Jacob's level. "Jacob Walker," came the quiet reply. Trump gave a small nod before straightening up and turning his full attention back to the officers. The temperature of his voice dropped several degrees as he addressed them directly. "Take those cuffs off him. Now." Officer Grant stiffened, his training warring with his recognition of who was giving the order. "So, we were just following protocol." "I said now." Trump's voice carried the kind of authority that had once commanded the attention of world leaders and Congress. There was no room for argument, no space for negotiation. "Take them off him immediately." The shorter officer, Daniels, stepped forward reluctantly. His hand shook slightly as he fumbled for the key to the handcuffs. The metallic click as they opened seemed to echo across the empty highway. Jacob rubbed his sore wrist gratefully, his fingers trembling from a mixture of relief and residual fear. Red marks from the metal cuffs were clearly visible on his dark skin, physical evidence of the unnecessary force that had been used against him. Trump gestured to one of his security agents. "Get him some water." The agent nodded immediately and retrieved a bottle from one of the SUVs, handing it to Jacob with professional courtesy. Jacob accepted it with shaky hands, murmuring a quiet thank you that seemed to hang in the air. The former president folded his arms and fixed the two officers with a stare that could have frozen fire. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades in public service and leadership. "What's your name?" he demanded of the taller officer. "Officer Grant," came the stiff reply. Trump's piercing gaze shifted to the second man. "And yours?" "Officer Daniels." Trump nodded slowly, his expression making it clear that he was memorizing every detail of this encounter. The officers were beginning to understand that this wasn't going to be swept under the rug or forgotten. This moment would follow them for the rest of their careers. The weight of Donald Trump's presence transformed the entire dynamic of the roadside encounter. What had begun as two officers bullying a teenage boy had become a moment of national significance, though none of them fully grasped the implications yet. Trump's security detail maintained their professional vigilance while their principal addressed what was clearly a gross abuse of power. "Do you know who I am?" Trump asked the officers, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had once addressed joint sessions of Congress and world leaders. Both officers nodded quickly, their postures rigid with nervous tension. "Yes, sir," they replied in unison. "Then you should understand the gravity of what I just witnessed," Trump continued, his gaze never wavering from their faces. "What I saw here was not police work. It was harassment, profiling, and abuse of power. You humiliated this young man and treated him like a criminal without any evidence of wrongdoing." Officer Grant attempted to defend their actions, his voice wavering with uncertainty. "Sir, we were just doing our job." The vehicle seemed suspicious for someone of his. "Stop right there," Trump interrupted, his voice rising with controlled anger. "Don't you dare finish that sentence. You pulled him over because of the color of his skin and the car he was driving. That's not policing. That's racism, pure and simple." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Both officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. They had been caught red-handed by someone whose word carried immense weight in American society. Trump took a step closer, his presence becoming even more imposing. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and humiliate innocent citizens. Tell me, did you even ask for his registration before you decided to put him in handcuffs?" The silence that followed spoke volumes. Neither officer could provide a satisfactory answer because there wasn't one. They had escalated the situation based on their own prejudices, not on any legitimate law enforcement concerns. "That's what I thought," Trump said, his tone filled with disgust. "You saw a young black man driving a decent car and immediately assumed he must have stolen it or was involved in something illegal. That kind of thinking has no place in law enforcement." Jacob, still recovering from his ordeal, watched the exchange with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. For years, his mother had warned him about encounters like this, telling him stories of young men who hadn't been fortunate enough to have someone intervene on their behalf. Trump turned his attention back to Jacob, his expression softening considerably. "Do you have someone you can call?" "Your parents." Jacob nodded, pulling out his phone with hands that were finally beginning to steady. "My mom." "Call her," Trump encouraged gently. Let her know you're all right and that this situation is being handled." As Jacob dialed his mother's number, Trump returned his attention to the officers. His voice took on the tone of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected millions of people. "I want your badge numbers and the name of your supervisor," he demanded. "This incident is going to be reported to the appropriate authorities, and there will be consequences for your actions." Officer Daniels fumbled for his notepad, his hands visibly shaking as he scribbled down the requested information. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They had been caught abusing their authority by a former president of the United States, and there would be no covering this up. Jacob's phone conversation with his mother was brief but emotional. "Mom, I'm okay," he said quietly. "Someone stopped to help me. I'll explain everything when I get home." The concern in his mother's voice was audible even from a distance. Jacob reassured her several times before hanging up, his own voice growing stronger with each word of comfort he offered her. Trump placed a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You're free to go. Son, drive safely and get home to your mother." As Jacob prepared to leave, Trump addressed the officers one final time. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood the power of public attention and media scrutiny. "What happened here today is unacceptable, and it's going to be investigated thoroughly. You two should be ashamed of yourselves. This young man handled himself with more dignity and respect than either of you showed throughout this entire encounter." Officer Grant made one last desperate attempt to justify their actions. "So, we were just following standard procedures." "Standard procedures?" Trump's voice rose with indignation. "There was nothing standard about what you did here. You profiled an innocent teenager, violated his rights, and treated him like a criminal. If this is your standard procedure, then the entire department needs to be overhauled." The former president's words carried implications that went far beyond this single incident. He was speaking about systemic issues that affected communities across the nation, and his involvement would ensure that this story received national attention. As Jacob climbed back into his car, he caught Trump's eye through the window. The older man gave him an encouraging nod that seemed to say everything would be all right. For the first time since those red and blue lights had appeared in his rearview mirror, Jacob felt genuinely safe. Trump stepped back as Jacob started his engine, but his protective presence remained. The black SUVs formed an informal escort as Jacob pulled back onto the highway, ensuring his safe departure from a scene that could have ended very differently. The officers stood in stunned silence as the motorcade disappeared into the distance. They had arrived at what they thought was a routine traffic stop and found themselves at the center of what would become a national conversation about race, justice, and accountability in law enforcement. Officer Grant turned to his partner, his face pale with the realization of what they had done. "We're finished," he said quietly. Daniels nodded grimly. They both understood that their careers in law enforcement were effectively over. More importantly, they were beginning to grasp the broader implications of their actions and the harm they had caused not just to Jacob, but to the community they had sworn to protect. As the sun set on Highway 64, the two officers were left alone with their shame and the knowledge that their moment of prejudice and abuse of power had been witnessed by one of the most powerful men in America. The morning after the highway encounter, Jacob Walker woke to a world that had fundamentally changed overnight. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, messages, and calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Social media platforms were ablaze with videos of the previous evening's events, and news outlets across the country were picking up the story with headlines that made his heart race. Trump intervenes in racial profiling incident. Read one. Former president saves black teen from police abuse. Declared another. The footage, captured by passing motorists and security cameras, showed every detail of the encounter, from Jacob being forced to the ground to Trump's commanding intervention. Jacob sat at his kitchen table with his mother, both of them scrolling through their phones in stunned silence. The story was spreading faster than wildfire, reaching millions of people within hours. Comments poured in from across the nation, with most expressing outrage at the officer's behavior and gratitude toward Trump for stepping in. His mother reached across the table and took his hand. "How are you feeling about all this attention?" Jacob shook his head slowly, still processing the magnitude of what was happening. "I never wanted to be famous. I just wanted to get home safely." Before his mother could respond, Jacob's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized from previous evening. His hands trembled slightly as he answered. "Jacob, "This is Donald Trump," came the familiar voice. "I wanted to check on you and let you know what we're doing about those officers." "Thank you for calling, sir," Jacob replied, his mother watching with wide eyes. "I'm okay, just trying to process everything." Trump's voice was warm but determined. "I've been in contact with the Department of Justice this morning. They're opening a formal investigation into Officers Grant and Daniels. I've also spoken with the FBI Civil Rights Division. This isn't going to be swept under the rug." Jacob felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. "Do you think they'll actually face consequences?" "They will," Trump replied with conviction. "I'm making sure of it. But Jacob, I need you to understand something important. This story is bigger than just what happened to you yesterday. People across the country are paying attention now. Your voice matters." After the call ended, Jacob sat quietly for several minutes, absorbing the weight of Trump's words. His mother squeezed his hand gently. "He's right. You know," she said softly. "This is your moment to make a difference." Over the next several days, the story continued to dominate news cycles. Video footage of the encounter was analyzed frame by frame on television programs. Legal experts weighed in on the officers' conduct, with most agreeing that their actions constituted clear violations of Jacob's constitutional rights. The police department where Grant and Daniels worked issued a carefully worded statement expressing regret if any actions were perceived as inappropriate, but the public wasn't satisfied with such a weak response. Pressure mounted for real accountability and meaningful action. Trump held a press conference 3 days after the incident, speaking to a packed room of reporters and cameras. His words were measured but powerful. "What happened to Jacob Walker represents a much larger problem in our country," he said. "Too many young people, particularly young black men, face this kind of treatment every day. Most of them don't have someone there to intervene. Most of their stories never make the news. But Jacob's story is shining a light on an issue we can no longer ignore." The press conference sparked another wave of national discussion. Social media hashtags like #JusticeForJacob and #EndRacial Profiling began trending. Protesters gathered outside police stations across the country, demanding reforms and accountability. Jacob found himself thrust into a role he had never sought but was beginning to embrace. Reporters requested interviews, and advocacy groups reached out asking him to share his story. His mother encouraged him to speak out, recognizing the platform he had been given. His first major television interview was with a national news network. Sitting across from the interviewer, Jacob felt nervous but determined. When asked how the experience had changed him, he spoke from his heart. "I realize now that this wasn't just about me," he said, his voice steady and clear. "This was about every black person who's been pulled over for no reason, questioned like a criminal, or treated as if they don't belong. I have a responsibility to speak for people who don't have a voice." The interview resonated with viewers across the country. Messages poured in from other young people who had experienced similar treatment, thanking Jacob for his courage in speaking out. Parents shared stories of having difficult conversations with their children about police encounters. Community leaders called for systemic changes in law enforcement training and accountability. Meanwhile, the investigation into Officers Grant and Daniels was proceeding rapidly. Body camera footage from their patrol car revealed additional evidence of misconduct, including disparaging comments they had made about Jacob during the encounter. Audio recordings captured their dismissive attitudes and clear signs of racial bias. The officers were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Their police union initially issued statements supporting them, but as more evidence emerged and public pressure mounted, even their strongest offenders began to distance themselves from the case. Jacob received a call from a congressional representative who was organizing hearings on police reform. "We'd like you to testify," she explained. "Your story has captured the nation's attention, and your voice could help drive real change." Jacob looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll do it," he said. "If it can help prevent this from happening to someone else, I'll do it." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. As Jacob prepared his testimony, he thought about all the people who had reached out to him, sharing their own stories of injustice and discrimination. He realized that his moment of terror on Highway 64 had become something much larger, a catalyst of conversations and changes that were long overdue. The night before his congressional testimony, Jacob stood in his bedroom, practicing his speech in front of the mirror. His mother watched from the doorway, pride evident in her eyes. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. Jacob straightened his shoulders and met his own gaze in the mirror. "I have to be. Too many people are counting on this moment to matter." The courthouse steps were packed with supporters holding signs demanding justice as Jacob Walker walked through the crowd toward the building where officers Grant and Daniels would face trial. News crews from every major network had positioned their cameras to capture this historic moment, the culmination of months of investigation, public pressure, and unwavering determination to hold law enforcement accountable. Inside the packed courtroom, tension filled the air like electricity. Jacob sat with his mother in the front row, both dressed formally for this momentous day. Across the aisle, Donald Trump entered with his security detail, nodding respectfully to Jacob before taking his seat. The former president's presence sent a clear message that he remained committed to seeing justice served. When the judge called the court to order, a hush fell over the crowded room. The charges against the officers were read aloud: excessive use of force, racial profiling, and misconduct under color of authority. Both defendants sat stiffly at the defense table, their earlier arrogance replaced by the stark reality of facing federal civil rights charges. The prosecution's opening statement painted a devastating picture of abuse of power. They methodically laid out how Jacob had committed no crime, violated no traffic laws, yet found himself handcuffed and pressed face down into gravel simply because two officers couldn't believe a black teenager could legitimately own a decent car. When Jacob took the witness stand, his voice carried a strength that had grown from months of advocacy and public speaking. He recounted every detail of that evening, from his peaceful drive home to the moment he found himself helplessly restrained on the roadside. "I kept thinking about my mother," Jacob testified, his voice steady but emotional. "She had always told me to comply, to be respectful, to keep my hands visible. I did everything she taught me, everything I was supposed to do. But it didn't matter to those officers. They had already decided I was guilty of something." The defense attorney attempted to challenge Jacob's account, suggesting he had been confrontational or threatening. But Jacob remained calm and composed, his responses highlighting the absurdity of their claims. "I was scared," Jacob said firmly. "But being scared of police officers who are treating you like a criminal isn't the same as being confrontational. I was 17 years old, alone on a highway, with two grown men with guns treating me like I had done something wrong when I knew I hadn't." When Trump took the witness stand, his testimony was equally powerful. He described what he had observed: a young man being brutalized and humiliated without cause, officers who showed no concern for constitutional rights or basic human dignity. "I stopped because it was the right thing to do," Trump testified. "Too many people have driven by scenes like this, telling themselves it wasn't their problem. But when you see injustice happening right in front of you, you have a choice. You can look away, or you can act. I chose to act." The defense's attempt to portray the incident as routine police work crumbled under weight of evidence. Body camera footage showed the officers' dismissive attitudes and clear racial bias. Audio recordings captured their derogatory comments and unprofessional conduct throughout the encounter. Expert witnesses testified about proper police procedures, explaining how every aspect of the officer's behavior violated established protocols and constitutional protections. The prosecution presented statistics about racial profiling, showing how Jacob's experience reflected a broader pattern of discriminatory enforcement. During closing arguments, the prosecutor addressed the jury directly. "This case isn't just about Jacob Walker, though he has shown remarkable courage in bringing his story forward. This case is about whether we as a society will tolerate law enforcement officers who abuse their power, who treat citizens differently based on the color of their skin." After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in applause before the judge called for order. Jacob felt his mother's hand squeeze his own as tears of relief rolled down both their faces. Outside the courthouse, the crowd cheered as news of the verdict spread. Jacob stood with Trump on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing around them as they addressed the gathering. "Today, justice was served," Jacob said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the crowd and through television broadcasts nationwide. "But this is just the beginning. We have to keep fighting for a system where everyone is treated fairly, where no one has to fear the very people who are supposed to protect them." Trump placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder as he spoke to the crowd. "Jacob Walker has shown incredible courage in standing up for what's right. His story has sparked a national conversation that was long overdue, but now we have to turn that conversation into action. In the months that followed, Jacob became a prominent voice in the police reform movement. He testified before Congress, spoke at universities across the country, and worked with civil rights organizations to push for legislative changes. His story became a rallying cry for communities demanding accountability and reform. The officer's conviction sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide. Police departments began reviewing their training protocols, implementing new oversight measures, and establishing clearer consequences for misconduct. The Jacob Walker case became a teaching example in police academies about the importance of constitutional policing and treating all citizens with dignity and respect. Jacob never forgot the moment on Highway 64 that changed his life. What began as a terrifying encounter with prejudice and abuse of power had transformed into a movement for justice and equality. He often thought about the countless others who had faced similar situations without anyone there to intervene, and he dedicated himself to ensuring their voices were heard. Years later, Jacob would look back on that evening as the moment he discovered his purpose. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles choose you, not the other way around. His journey from a scared teenager on a roadside to a national advocate for civil rights proved that even in the darkest moments, courage and justice could prevail. The road ahead remained long and challenging, but Jacob Walker had shown that change was possible. One person, standing up for what's right, could make a difference. And with the support of allies like Donald Trump, who understood the power of using privilege to protect others, that difference could ripple across a nation, inspiring others to demand the justice and equality that every American deserves. Jacob's story became more than just a news headline. It became a testament to the power of courage, the importance of allies, and the enduring hope that tomorrow could be better than today. On that stretch of Highway 64, a young man's dignity had been restored, and a movement for justice had been born.